As Muslims, we know the dunya is temporary. We understand detachment as a concept. We hear the reminders, we read it in the Quran, we say it to each other when things go wrong. But that doesn't seem to stop us from getting completely consumed by our attachments to it, whether it's a person we can't let go of, or a version of our life that we're still grieving, or just this constant cycle of putting our trust in something and being let down by it. I spent a long time thinking this was just a personal failing, that some people were just wired to attach too easily. But then I came across something in neuroscience that made everything click, and I realised that Islam had given us the solution all along. Every time you decide that you're going to care less about something, but your behaviour stay exactly the same, your brain reads that behaviour as confirmation that this thing still matters. And this is why you can decide over and over again that you're going to detach from the dunya and stop allowing the same things to hurt you, but still find yourself constantly thinking and worrying and being emotionally dependent on things and people in ways that you don't want to be. And most of the time we see this as our own weakness, but in reality it's just your brain doing exactly what it was built to do, which is to protect what it has learned to rely on and to stay in the comfort zone. And if what it has learned to rely on is anything other than Allah, it means that your brain has slowly built its architecture around the dunya being its source. So neuroscience tells us that the brain can change and build entirely new ways of responding to the world, but only when it's genuinely being challenged, which means being pushed beyond what has become automatic. Think about it like this: when you do something on autopilot, whether that's automatically reaching for your phone when you feel upset or anxious, or find yourself going back to a person or a habit, your brain isn't really engaged in that moment. It's just running a program that it already knows, which means that there's no reason to build anything new. But the moment you disrupt that pattern and actually sit with the discomfort instead of immediately trying to relieve it and then direct the needs to Allah instead, your brain then has to engage in a way that it hasn't before, and that's when new pathways start to form. And so when you finally decide to detach or walk away from something or make the step to break a habit that you know isn't good for you, you're not just fighting feelings, you're fighting the physical structure of your brain, which will obviously feel incredibly uncomfortable and stressful because your brain is just trying to keep you safe. It's trying to keep you in the comfort zone. It's resisting the change. And a lot of the time we take this friction, this challenge, as a sign that we're doing something wrong or that we're failing. And that's where most people give up and blame themselves for being too weak. But this is the part that I found so interesting that I managed to link back to the Quran immediately. So from a neuroscience perspective, your brain actually needs the stress. The agitation that you feel when you're trying to break an old behavior is just your brain releasing the chemical signals that are needed to rewrite those pathways. So just think, new pathways means new behaviors, which means that if it wasn't for the discomfort and the huge challenge that we just talked about that comes with trying to detach, trying to change the behavior, there would be no change because the chemical signals required wouldn't be released. And the Quran already talked about this over 1400 years ago. Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ. And perhaps you hate something and it is good for you. Perhaps you love something and it is bad for you. And in this context, we might hate the discomfort of the rewiring process, but now we know that it's good for us because it's the only way the old pathways break down. But what we tend to do is that we feel the resistance and immediately want to give up. But Allah sees the bigger picture of what that struggle is building inside of us. Okay, so now I've understood that the brain requires a challenge to actually change its behaviors. So how do you actually build the attachment? And the second thing neuroscience tells us is that consistency is what actually builds new attachments, and what you consistently give your attention to is what your brain sees as important. So the brain strengthens whatever you show up for repeatedly, and that's how attachment is generally built. And this is where a lot of us go wrong, because we wait until we actually feel spiritually motivated to turn to Allah and then wonder why the dunya still feels like the default place to go for comfort. But that's just because the brain goes where it has the most evidence of being sent. So if you've spent years consistently turning to people, to distraction, to anything other than Allah when you're upset or when you're in need, that is the pathway your brain has built, and the only way to redirect this is to start building a new one. Now listen to this. The Prophet ﷺ said that the most beloved deeds to Allah are the ones that are consistent even if they were small. And I feel like a lot of the times we interpret Islamic advice as, just like spiritual encouragement, but this hadith is literally in line with how the brain is designed to form new pathways, and I just find that fascinating. So the person who turns to Allah consistently, even when it's the most smallest effort, even on the days where they really don't feel like it, as long as the intention to draw closer to Him is sincerely there, they are slowly but genuinely retraining their brain to go to Allah first. And this is how the dunya stops being the default. It doesn't happen through one big moment of clarity, it doesn't happen through cutting the whole world off overnight. It happens through the small repeated actions of choosing Allah instead. And something that really helped me to understand detachment from an Islamic perspective was an ayah in the Quran that I came across around 2 years ago. And honestly, remembering this ayah does something to my nervous system that brings an instant calm when I remember it. And it's an ayah in Surah Al-An'am where Ibrahim AS says, "La uhibbul afilin." I do not love those that set. So in the context of this ayah, the Quran tells us the story of Ibrahim AS where he looks towards a star and then the moon and then the sun and confirms that it's impossible for any of these things to be his Lord because of the one thing that they have in common, which is that they set, meaning that they eventually vanish and disappear. And what I find so interesting is that he says, "I do not love those that set." He could have said, "I do not worship those that set." But his specific use of the word love here shows us that a large part of worship is devotion and attachment of the heart. And a heart that is deeply attached to something that will eventually disappear is a heart that will inevitably be broken by that disappearance. And the heart was made to attach to something permanent, something that doesn't vanish for even a moment. And when it lives somewhere that it wasn't designed for, it suffers. And that's not because you're doing something wrong, it's because you're asking it to do something that it wasn't built for. You can even think of the heart without its attachment to Allah as like the body without water, in that it will keep reaching for substitutes and none of them will ever be enough. One of my favorite things to do in videos is draw examples from nature and the world around us that sort of resemble what's inside of us. So if we take the moon in this context, when we look up towards a night sky and see this bright, beautiful, glowing moon, it's easy to forget that the moon doesn't actually produce a single spark of light on its own. Everything we see and admire about this beautiful, glowing moon is borrowed, it's reflecting a different light source. And I feel like this dynamic is so similar to the way we form attachments to the people and things around us in life. Because when you find yourself drawn to someone's qualities or you feel that sense of safety and comfort in their presence, those feelings are completely real and valid. But just like the moon reflecting the sun, what you're actually responding to is a reflection of Allah's attributes shining through that person. They aren't the actual source of that peace or kindness or comfort or whatever it is that you were attached to in the first place, and they can't guarantee that it will always be there. And they're simply just carrying a blessing that Allah placed in them, just like how the moon carries light that it didn't create. And because we tend to forget this, it then becomes incredibly painful when those people inevitably change or they leave or simply they just let us down. And sometimes it can feel like when they leave, they've taken all of that light and that warmth and all of the good qualities with them. But the comfort for a Muslim lies in realizing that the light was never theirs to take in the first place, because the true source of the light is permanent. And the Quran uses the sun and the moon and the stars, but we know that this applies to everything in this dunya. People leave, relationships end, careers fall apart. Look at nature, even the oldest trees will eventually die. Nothing here was made to last. And this might sound morbid to some people or like a negative perspective, but it's actually the most grounding fact of life to exist, because it stops us from building our whole lives around things that were always going to be temporary. And as Muslims, it also stops us from seeing the akhirah as some distant, scary concept. It allows us to see it as the permanence that our soul is yearning for. And this is actually one of the ways to practice the Islamic version of detachment, which we call Zuhd. So Zuhd basically means living in the dunya without allowing the dunya to live in your heart. And around the beginning, we talked about breaking free from an attachment. When it comes to Zuhd, it's about maintaining a state of detachment from the dunya. And this doesn't mean hating the world or abandoning your responsibilities or just turning your back on everyone. It means making sure the dunya serves your journey to Allah instead of it becoming the thing that your heart lives for, because nothing in this world truly belongs to us. When I was living in Turkey, there was someone who I would go to a lot for advice, and whenever I would say, this person hurt me or this person did this, she would always say, it's because you made them your focus instead of Allah. It's that simple. Whatever takes most of your attention, that's where your heart lives. And the disappointment you feel is because you built expectations for creation that you should have only built for Allah. And this is something that I remember a lot, because it's not really criticism, it's an honest diagnosis. We don't attach to people because there's something wrong with us. We attach because we're looking for something permanent, something that doesn't actually exist in this dunya, and we keep searching for it in places that were never able to give it to us. And that's where making Allah your best friend actually comes in, because when you've built the habit of consistently returning to Allah through dhikr, through salah, through learning His names, through learning about Him, through the small daily acts that keep bringing your attention back to Him, you will start to see Allah everywhere. And I genuinely mean this when I say that this changes everything about how you experience life. Like, it literally feels like living life the premium way, because you will naturally begin to notice and appreciate Allah in the smallest details of your day, and you stop seeing things at face value, because instead of the feeling stopping at the thing thing itself, you learn to trace it back to its source. This blessing is from Al-Wahhab, this is from Al-Jamil, this is Al-Wadud that is showing up. Do you know what I mean? You're not detaching from the creation, you're just tracing all goodness back to its source. And this applies to negative emotions as well. When creation does what it always does and falls short and disappoints, it means you have somewhere to redirect. If someone is unfair to you, you remember that Allah is the most just and He will always restore your rights. If someone lets you down, you remember that Allah is Al-Wali, He's the true protector who will never let you down. If someone breaks your trust, you remember that Allah is the most trustworthy, the one who will never betray you. If you feel unseen or unheard, you remember that Allah is Sami al-Basir, the all-hearing, the all-seeing, who sees and hears all of the things that nobody else does. And you could literally apply this to so many things. If you feel unworthy, you remember that your worth is with Allah and not the creation. And I actually practice this mindset a lot, to the point that it's become automatic for me now. And it's basically recognizing what creation will inevitably fall short of and finding it with Allah. And that's how you make Allah your best friend, by tracing all good things back to Him as the source of all goodness, and by finding in Him what the dunya could never give. And again, that doesn't mean that we should just cut everybody off, and stop forming meaningful connections and, stop loving our friends and our family. It just means that we need to stop making other people or the dunya the center of our universe. The harsh reality is that everybody has their own lives, everybody has their own problems, everybody has their own things going on. People get busy, they move forward, and because we're all just flawed human beings, we also make mistakes. People are eventually going to let you down if you make them your main focus. That's just how this dunya works. It's something that we need to force ourselves to accept. Let them off the hook. Forgive them for the sake of Allah, and shift all of that energy into working on yourselves instead. And just on that topic, as one last piece of advice for this video, honestly, just find something to do. When you have too much free time, you will absolutely just end up sitting there and spiraling and getting pulled right back into exactly what you are trying to walk away from. Fill that free time with something that keeps you busy. Throw the energy into a project, learn new skills, build a business, and I promise there is always something to do. And you and I both know that you already have that to-do list of unfinished projects anyway. But the key is to tie the purpose of whatever you're doing back to Allah. When you're genuinely focused on a task and you make the intention that doing it well is a way of seeking Allah's pleasure, you will actually start building a life that is full of barakah and one that feels meaningful on its own without external validation. And that is what makes it so much easier to move forward and stop looking backwards.